We hope this webinar will prove to be interesting and will share some useful insights about the election and the economy and the interplay between the two. And we'll tease out where distressed opportunities may lie for all of us that are employed in the insolvency world after this election. I'd like to start with a clever political joke. But you know the problem with political jokes, too many of them get elected. So instead, I'll jump right into our agenda and the first of two polls. You should see a poll pop up on your screen which asks which of the two front-running candidates you would expect to have a more positive impact on the economy. We're going to give a couple seconds for some voting to come in so that we know that people are hearing us and seeing the screen. Like about half of you have voted. We're going to give you just a couple more seconds to vote. We're going to close the voting in just a couple of seconds. Any last votes, please get in. All right, so we'll close that first poll now. Looks like 59% of you think that Donald Trump will have a more positive impact on the economy. Interesting. Okay, so let's jump in now to our agenda. I'm Ken Mann. What I'm going to do is introduce our panelists to you today and set the stage for the presentation that they'll give to you. Then next will be Ken Yeager from New Point Advisors. He'll talk about which industries are in trouble now and which are likely to be impacted by each of the two candidates in various ways. And then Chuck Seeley from Heritage Global Valuations will speak to us about appraisal issues, specifically about how distress and rapid change in an industry impacts appraisals and things that you need to be aware of. And then last but not least, Jerry Wilcoxon from Wilcoxon Consulting will talk through M&A activity and enterprise valuation, and you'll see some of the trends in the industries that Ken Yeager points out to us. And then we'll leave a little bit of time, hopefully, to answer at least a few questions following the presentation. You can send questions in throughout by using the dashboard that you see on your screen, and we'll try to pick a few and answer those at the end of the presentation. So thanks everybody for participating. I again am Ken Mann, the Senior Managing Director at Heritage Equity Partners. During my 22-year career, my team and I have brokered about 500 lower middle market transactions for distressed businesses all around the United States in just about every industry you can think of. I'm regularly an author and a speaker for various trade associations and publications, usually on topics of distressed M&A, things like 363 sales, bid procedures, and valuations in distress. Ken Yeager is the president of New Point Advisors Corporation. Ken has over 25 years of executive business leadership experience and has been involved in more than 100 turnaround cases. He is the creator of Tame and Cash Flow Launcher. Chuck Seeley is the managing director and an accredited senior appraiser for Heritage Global Valuations. He's a 26-year veteran of the appraisal and liquidation industry. A very strong background in valuation of machinery, equipment, and inventory. Chuck previously worked for leading asset-based lender Fleet Capital, which is now Bank of America, as well as with nationally recognized valuation firms. He's appraised capital assets and inventory at many companies in many industries, and his appraisals are relied upon by leading lenders, companies, attorneys, turnaround professionals, and private equity groups. Gary Wilcoxon is the managing director. He's a CPA accredited as an expert in business valuation at Wilcoxon Consulting. Jerry's been focused on providing business valuation, transaction advisory, and CFO level consulting services to small businesses since 2005. prepared over 200 enterprise valuation reports. Prior to his valuation focus, Jerry was a partner in a local public accounting firm, held CFO and controller positions in transportation, long-term care, and technology industries, and he has served as a director of a bank from 1993 until the sale of that community bank in 2015. So to set the stage for our three presenters, here's the current picture. As we all know, probably all too well, bankruptcy has been in decline in recent years, and that is important to all of us in the insolvency world. Likewise, delinquencies are at a low point historically. The next bullet is one that impacts elections, and that is gross domestic product has been in the sub 2% range and seems to be holding there. No incumbent on the presidential ticket. That tends to impact the economy, and we have a very angry electorate leading to some unlikely competitive candidates, namely Trump and Sanders. I mentioned bankruptcies being low. You can see the steady decline from 2010 through 2015. There is a slight uptick in early 2016 if you look to the far right. January, year over year, a little bit down, but you can see February and March are up over 2015, although still down off prior years. And same trend for delinquencies and charge-offs. You can see here a peak so after 2008-9, and then it gradually or rapidly comes down and hits a bottom in 2014-2015, and now a little bit of an uptick, which is driven by weakness in the energy sector. We are seeing some tightening of credit, which would indicate that we're going to start to move up the graph again in terms of delinquencies and charge-offs. Back to GDP, you can see here from 1980 on what GDP looked like. Of course, it plummets after the Great Recession. We're in negative territory for a bit, and then we come back to about 2% over the last 5 years, and that trend is expected in 2016 and 2017, sub 2% for 2016, and that will be relevant. So the first question that I'll ask is, what is the economy's impact on the election? Conventional wisdom is that it has a tremendous impact, or as Bill Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid. But our research didn't really indicate that. The reality is that incumbents win and lose at the same pace, irrespective of good or bad economy. What does seem to matter is the trend in the 4 years, the last 4 years, and particularly the last 2 of any administration. Jobs probably mean a lot less than you think. Looked at when incumbents ran, and they tend to win even with high unemployment. However, they tend to lose when GNP is low during their final 2 years. Going back over the last 6 or 8 incumbent elections, the incumbent lost if GNP was low, and the average for the losers was 1.87%. So with the stage set, we'll now move to Ken Yeager of New Point Advisors, who's going to dig a little bit into how elections impact economies and then get into some specific industries.
All right, Ken, thank you very much. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the markets and the elections. So one of the interesting things about the markets is they don't care for uncertainty. And what could be more uncertain than a time when there's no incumbent running? And as Ken Mann just pointed out, GNP is running at a rate where we are looking at it barely a 2% GDP. Kind of makes an interesting toss-up on who could be elected in the next election. Lots of things breaking in different directions. So we are expecting probably with this some turmoil in the market over the next few months as we approach the election, and probably for a short period of time after, particularly if someone like Donald Trump, who is very much of an outsider, the market tries to address what they're going to do. However, interestingly enough, while the GDP can affect a president and whether they are going to be reelected or not, study after study has shown that a president's impact on the broader economy is negligible. And there are a couple, I've quoted one of the articles that shows, or one of the papers from a couple of guys from Princeton that proved this out from a number of different angles. However, all that having been said, presidents, while they may not affect the overall economy, they do affect and have a big impact on industries. And so that's where we're going to focus our discussion for the next couple of minutes. We've set up a chart here for you, and let me walk you through it. To the very far left, we have distressed industries, and there are several that are already known to be distressed here on this chart, starting from the energy, ag, manufacturing, scrap, shipping, education, healthcare, brick and mortar, and the commodity distributions. Next to them is issue types, and this is sort of what's happening to those industries. Are they having cyclical problems? Are they having systemic industry issues that are related to different issues, things like regulations or technology? And then next to this, we have 8 columns. The first 4 are about next 2 are about Democrats, whether they're pro or con that industry. And then next to that is whether Clinton's platform is pro or con for that industry. Then going further over, we have the Republicans pro and con for various industries. And finally, we have Trump pro or con for the various industries. So let's walk a little bit deeper. Let me walk you through some of the highlights of what we've got in front of us. First thing is the energy industries, the first 3, oil and gas, coal, and alternative energy. When you look at the last 8 years, Obama has really pushed hard on carbon emitters, and that has really affected the coal industry. And turned what could be a cyclical power industry issue that's going on with oil and alternative right now into a systemic issue. If Clinton is elected, she will continue the press against coal, and probably will also be somewhat negative to the nuclear power industry as well. On the flip side of this, the Republicans tend to be pro-energy advocates, if you will, and Donald Trump is very much for the oil and gas industry. On the flip side, he's okay with the nuclear industry, but does not like alternative energy. For those of you who are looking at the energy industry and the distress right now and seeing the bonanza that's coming out of Houston with all the bankruptcies, I caution you to curb some of your enthusiasm. Goldman Sachs came out with a report this week that says that oil should stabilize this quarter at $45 a barrel and should go to $50 a barrel by the end of this year, putting it square in the middle between the want and the need. The industry needs $40 a barrel and it wants $60 a barrel, so that may actually stem some of the activity in that area come later this year. Not so much an election issue, but as you see that industry, the energy industry kind of playing out, the market's going to do that to it. Moving on the agricultural industry, not much to report on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, very interesting rift has been developing. The Republicans generally pro-farm, pro-agriculture, but because of Clinton's stand on immigration and protectionism, particularly with Mexico, he's likely to force migrant workers out of the workforce in the U.S., causing food prices to rise dramatically in a quick if he follows through on some of his promises. The next industry, kind of going to lump together manufacturing, scrap, and shipping. Really, manufacturing, if it's auto and housing, we're doing fine. But if you're trying to ship stuff overseas, right now things are a little bit choppy, and that's what makes things difficult. We know about the slowdown in China causing the scrapping industry, and worldwide the GDP is down, so shipping is actually struggling dramatically. And what's going to happen here is with the Democrats, there's not a lot of foreign policy that is affecting these areas, but on the Republican side tend to be pro for these production or industries and manufacturing. But on the Trump side, what he has come up with is a lot of protectionism conversations. He's talked about raising tariffs on countries that are not following world trade tariffs, raising U.S. tariffs against them by 35%. This goes directly against China, and there are some European players that Trump has pointed out, and this could cause quite a bit of, take an industry that's, or series of industries that are already struggling and really put them into a serious hurt. So that's kind of what's going on in that space. Moving on, education, kind of an interesting one, more of a Democratic story here. Education has been in trouble for a number of years, can't get enough tuition, and then when they do, no one's getting the ROI out of the tuition they've had to pay. And so the Clinton administration is picking up the pro-Democratic ticket and really moving towards what Obama started, which is tuition subsidies. This will may cause that industry to consolidate. It may actually support that industry, but it's going to definitely cause some issues for education in the coming months or in the coming years. Healthcare. interesting tug of war. This industry was already in distress and has been since 2010. It really never came out like the other industries. Healthcare reform on the Democratic side will continue with Hillary. She was one of the early proponents back in 1994. On the Republican side, they really are looking for, they talk about reversing it. I think they really want to change it. Clinton is carrying on that mantle himself. And what will happen here with healthcare is what is already a dynamic industry that's already changing and has a lot of rough spots could get tossed into if there's a Republican winner, tossed into quite a sea of change, and no one really know what to think of next, and cause more distress there. Last comments are on the brick and mortar and commodity industries. What's going on here is on the Democratic side, it's kind of a national trend that's not really hit any states yet, but is definitely being talked about. Certainly Bernie Sanders was big on this. And that's raising minimum wage from $7.75 an hour to $15 an hour. If that happens, the brick and mortar industry that's already in trouble because of things like Amazon and Walmart, and the commodity industry, which relies heavily upon minimum wage workers to move assets, will see a sharp increase in costs on the labor side in their businesses. And for brick and mortar, overall, one would say, well, you're raising the income for a lot of people so they'll be able to buy more. In the aggregate, this probably works out. However, at the company level, you take an example of a distressed company like Sports Authority, there's no way that they could pass on the cost of higher labor, and it would cause more demise. So there's probably a lot of retailers on the precipice just like them. So Ken, that's what we see in the industries. I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Ken, for helping us understand the impact on specific industries. Let's turn to Chuck Seeley now for some help in understanding appraisal issues in distressed industries and during changing economic times. Chuck?
Good afternoon, everybody. Yep, I'm here. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to try to weave in how presidential elections and regulations may impact the asset valuation side of things. It's going to be a bit more historical, lessons learned, but obviously believe that it's an excellent, understanding today and in the future with the impending presidential election. As an industry goes, so does its assets. As you might expect, a change in presidential administration, regulations, or even the hint of regulations can very quickly impact industries and respective asset values. As an example, there's been some benefits to solar and biofuels, but coal has been in the crosshairs of the current administration. And honestly, the next presidential administration and policies may likely decide the fate of that industry. Already values have been slipping significantly on equipment, inventory, and other assets related to mining, and there will likely be further declines based on the aforementioned. I'm going to try to focus on several asset classes, or touch on them a bit. It would be machinery and equipment, inventory, and real estate. Industry distressed, or your appraised value is accurate. Comparable sales are historical, you've got to remember that. Although the basis of virtually all market-based appraisals of equipment, inventory, etc., comparables are in the past. What's important is that the appraiser understands industry dynamics, technology changes, and other issues such as political climate, regulations, both current and impending. And it's important they know how to adjust those comparables to more accurately reflect current market values, especially in times where there's a particular industry facing distressed or boom times. When you're doing appraisals, honestly, they're only good as the effective date. Love to be able to predict the future, but can't. The effective date generally is the date the appraiser completes an inspection of assets, or in the case of a desktop where no physical inspection is made, the date of the report. All the comparable information in appraisals is generally predates the effective end report date, and anything that happens after that effective date theoretically cannot and should not be used or considered. Again, in a rapidly changing marketplace, the values presented could be trailing actual market values literally as of the day the report is released. It's important to get, appropriate updates on your appraisals, not just sit in a file. Frequency for appraisal updates can vary based on a variety of factors, including financial health of the subject company, condition of the assets, etc. However, those assets and industries that are under stress due to past, present, or, quite honestly, future government regulation or policy may need to be appraised more frequently to make sure the collateral values are holding up.
Chuck, you talk about the fact that comparables are historical. I'm not sure that people realize how historical. What's a typical look-back time in an appraisal?
Well, obviously, appraisers want the most recent and similar comps, but getting both, is tough sometimes. Generally, comparables for machinery and equipment can be honestly up to 1 to 2 years old. For general-purpose real estate in metro areas, it could be only months old. However, in the case of rural or special-purpose real estate properties, you may need to go out years. But it's important to realize as comps get more dated, or quite honestly less similar, there's more room for inaccuracy if correct adjustments aren't made.
Gotcha, thanks.
I'd like to talk a little bit, no problem. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Great Recession. I mean, although historical, once again, like I mentioned in the beginning, the Great Recession gives us a recent example of how errant government policy can quickly affect the economy in many, if not all, industries. The recession created rapidly declining asset values, so, like I'd never seen in my lifetime. And this was across almost all industries, but some market segments were hit much harder. Obviously, the home building sector was one of those, and that included, ancillary like woodworking, lumber mill equipment, home furnishings, etc. All those industries were hit hard. It's important that the appraiser is aware of what industries are being impacted by, quite honestly, recent changes in administration and regulations when performing an appraisal assignment. At that time, a lot of much of the equipment from these failed companies ended up in the marketplace. There's no home for it in the U.S., so it ended up overseas. Manufacturers also cut prices due to decreased demand, so that's obviously another thing. So we had a very limited amount of equipment here in the U.S., not that we needed it at that time, but it was definitely hurt. But as we came out of the recession, there was definitely a lack of equipment, inventory, et cetera, necessary. And with that came significant increases in both used and new equipment. New equipment manufactured to contribute to significant demand for both new and used equipment with long lead times. They've been reluctant to build inventories, obviously, during the recession, laid off workers, and now we're needing to play catch-up. Honestly, at that time, it was very rare in my career that I would do reappraisals of assets and see, whether it equipment or inventory, et cetera, prices rise or values rise. When I'd done an appraisal a year earlier and they were up 10, 20, 30%. But that was what I was seeing then, and I had never seen that in my 26 years in this business. Unfortunately, any webinar that we do these days has to, especially on distressed industries, needs to mention oil and gas or alternative industries. There's been a nearly 60% oil price drop from 2014 highs. It's created stress across the energy industry. I mean, this is from exploration and production enterprises, oil field service providers, and midstream and downstream companies. Nobody is immune. I mean, it's all related industries. And that's not only directly with oil and gas, but also in the economies, especially in Dakotas and Texas. I mean, from restaurants to car dealers to hotels, everyone is feeling the impact. It's not only, once again, oil and gas exploration and production companies suffering, but the suppliers to that, companies involved in transportation, water management services, well servicing, et cetera. These ancillary businesses are already feeling the impact as exploration and production companies retrench their operations and reduce their capital expenditures in the face of declining prices. Even alternative energy sources such as solar, coal, and biofuels are no longer as attractive to pursue due to the low oil and gas prices. It's created stress across the entire energy industry with these cheap oil and gas prices. I want to talk a little bit about inventory. Understanding the inventory costing methods of a company is critical, as generally this is the basis of all inventory appraisals. It's important to note, should the company's method of costing of their inventory on the perpetual inventory system change, so would the orderly liquidation value percentages provided in the appraisal report. Commodity prices can be volatile, and in times where commodity prices have rapidly escalated, the company's costs may not truly reflect current market value and may in fact be understated very quickly. Conversely, if the prices for commodities quickly decline, the company's costs may overstate the value of the inventory compared to the current market value at the time. An example of this is lumber prices. Lumber prices can change more than 30% within a few months. Right now, framing lumber composite prices have decreased approximately $33 per thousand board feet, which is about 9.5% since February 2015. Prices have begun to recover in recent months, mainly due to the housing starts increasing, which is primarily due to job growth, favorable interest rates, and affordable home prices, which are all creating demand for these raw materials. However, despite this demand, there is also some hindrances, including tight lending conditions for acquisitions, construction and development loans, as well as shortages of construction lots and labor. So takeaway, we need to keep those appraisals fresh, especially in distressed inventories or distressed economies or volatile economies, and especially in light of the new presidential administration coming into power. Things can change very quickly. Policies can change very quickly, and you need to keep an eye on those appraisals. You need to make sure the inventory is priced according to accurately to reflect current market prices. Again, as mentioned, in a dynamic market where raw material pricing can quickly change, values of inventory could be rapidly over or understated. And pay attention when lending into industries that one candidate or another could have a negative impact on. Make sure that any of those appraisals in distressed industries that are revisited more often, and in terms of a reappraisal, the post-Obama presidency may look very different very quickly.
Thanks, Chuck. I guess to no one's surprise, you're suggesting that people do more appraisals. But I guess I would ask, when you say keep them fresh and things like that, what does that mean? How often in a distressed industry, should somebody be reappraising?
Well, typically for inventory, we're generally seeing, our clients appraise once a year for standard inventories. But I think, in a distressed industry where there's more volatility, you may want to look at it quarterly or at least twice a year. M&E real estate or machinery equipment of real estate, it really depends on the client. We see them generally being reappraised annually again, or maybe a little further out. But once again, it may be something where you want to revisit this, once or twice a year, or actually twice a year, just a little more than you had done previously.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Chuck. Well, before we turn to Jerry, let's see what the audience thinks about our final poll, which asks where you expect to see the most activity and distress in the coming 18 months. So please go ahead and take this opportunity to vote. We'll pause for a second. Got about half of you voted in. Let's wait a couple more seconds. We certainly appreciate everybody's active participation. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll in about 2 seconds, and I'll tell you where we finished up. Looks like people believe almost evenly at 40% each, retail and manufacturing, and then healthcare being next at 21%, then agriculture at 17%, and then education at 10%. So manufacturing and retail, the big winners on that one. Okay, so we're now going to turn to Jerry Wilcoxon on our final topic, which is to address values and M&A activity, and Jerry Wilcoxon will lead us through this piece.
Thanks, Ken. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to spend the next 10 or so minutes talking about M&A activity. We're going to show some slides specifically to the industries that Ken Yeager and Chuck Shealy talked about. But first, we're going to talk about enterprise values, and more specifically what drives values from the perspective of investors and the market. So when we look at value, we traditionally look at value as the simple equation is value equals benefit stream divided by risk. And if we explore what we mean by benefit stream, it's simply revenues minus expenses. So when we talk about which candidate's going to come in with this next election, we have to have a conversation and look at which candidate's going to drive revenues. I think Ken Yeager mentioned in the oil and gas world, revenues should be driven more in a Trump presidency. If we talk about expenses, any push towards minimum wage increase is going to tend to drive expenses up. So any activities along the platforms of either candidate will have an impact on both revenues, expenses, and more importantly, into the benefit streams. Then the next component, of course, is the risk. When we talk about benefit stream being divided by risk, what we're talking about with respect to risk is assigning a value or a percentage to develop a cap rate, and this is all based on competing investments. So when we look at risk in two components. We look at systemic risk and non-systemic risk. In systemic risk, what we're looking at is the performance in the public markets, and this would be the bond market and the stock market. And within the stock market, we look at specific industries or look at performance within specific industries to determine whether the risk, for example, in a specific industry, one noted earlier was healthcare, is going to provide or produce a greater risk, for example, than the actual public market itself. And then within non-systemic risks, what we're looking at are specifically those risks associated with the specific company itself. So when we look at the components of systemic risk and we actually build up what our competing capital would look like, we start off with the risk-free rate, and that is commonly associated with long-term U.S. Treasuries and certain municipal bond markets. We add to that the equity risk premium associated with the U.S. stock market, and this is based over long-term performance. It's not simply what's happened over the last year or, for example, in 2008 when 2009 when the market dipped down to just under 6,700. The equity risk premium has always been looked at in terms of a long-term, over a period of 70, 80, 90 years. And then we add to that the size of the company and the specific industry, and these are typically, as indicated through publicly traded companies. This is all data compiled on those. So we add those three up to obtain our systemic risk, and then we add to that the company's specific risks. And these are risks that are primarily indigenous to the company itself, and you primarily see most of these risks associated with the small or medium-sized business, commonly known as the SMB marketplace. And examples of some company-specific risks that we commonly see that add to the risks associated with the cost of capital. One is depth of management, or more importantly, lack of depth of management, wherein you have a reliance on a key man or a sole shareholder. Another risk that adds to the profile is skilled labor or a lack of skilled labor or talent pool. And lastly, or more importantly, is access to capital. Most small to medium-sized businesses are restricted in terms of their access to capital as opposed to the public markets.
If I could interrupt and ask you a question there. A lot of us have worked with small to medium-sized companies in distress. We see a very common theme, which is an over-reliance on a single customer. So in looking at company-specific risk, do you factor in concentration risk of receivables and revenue?
Absolutely. That's probably, of the company-specific risks, anytime you're looking at valuations, whether they be of healthy companies or distressed companies, that's probably the single biggest, what we'll call, addition to the risk profile for the small and medium-sized. That and key man dependency. So anytime you have a customer concentration, obviously that's going to increase the risk associated with that customer. Okay. Here's a slide. In this slide here, what I'm illustrating is the difference between the risk associated with public and what I'll call private and small companies. And on the bottom sector here on the slide, you'll see that as the risk goes up, the corresponding relation to that would be the multiples will go down. So if we look at the three components of systemic risk, which are the risk-free rate, the size in the industry, and the equity risk premium, typically the combination of those three deliver cap rates somewhere in the 10 to 16% range, which correspondingly gives you multiples in the 6 to 10 times earnings range. So this is what you're traditionally, and again, this is in the absence of any kind of real red-hot market, traditional multiples would suggest that the 6 to 10 is what you'll find for a multiple in these companies. When you start going up a little bit more higher risk companies, and these are the smaller private companies, your range of cap rates, when you add into the specific company risk, can jump up anywhere from 20 to 50%, and in all likelihood, the 50% category would be those with specific concentrations in sole customers or with reliance on sole shareholders. And when you have cap rates in that range, you have corresponding multiples in the 2 to 5 times earnings range. So therein lies the great disparity between what public companies will trade for in 6 to 10 and even higher, and whereas some of the smaller, more privately held companies where they trade. Okay, now we're going to talk about, next couple slides, what we're going to do is talk about the market in general, what we've seen in terms of transaction volume, and what we've seen in some of the industries Ken Yeager and Chuck Seeley talked about. But before that, let's real quick conversation on what drives M&A activity in these markets. Obviously, new technologies, advent of the internet back in Y2K, and certainly any and all B2B and B2C e-commerce, which has driven down the activity in the brick and mortar. Consolidation in industries, we're seeing that as was illustrated before in the healthcare world. Demographics, we can't understate the value or what's going on with the demographics. The same baby boomer generation that drove real estate markets in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s is now driving M&A activity. These same individuals who are business owners, or many of them who are business owners, are now between the ages of 55 and 70 and looking to exit, looking to sell their business. So that in and of itself is going to drive the market. What kills M&A markets are two primary things. One is lack of capital, and we can certainly see that as evidence in 2009 when the stock market hit its bottom in the 2008 2009 window when it bottomed out, and banks and primarily all lending institutions and sources of capital dried up. The other thing that kills markets is uncertainty, and that can certainly come along with election years. So the next couple slides, what we're going to talk about is what's been going on with M&A transactions and with the total capital invested. And we can see from this slide, beginning in 2009, activity, the number of transactions has been on a considerable rise, peaking last year with just over 20,000 transactions. And these are all M&A controlled transactions. These are not transactions wherein just a majority interest or minority interest are sold. These are controlled transactions. So in 2009, we peaked with over 20,000 transactions, and the total capital invested a little over $3.3 billion. We look at 2016 activity, and just so everybody knows, 2016 activity is activity from January through March 31 of this year. So what we're seeing so far this year is M&A activity is not slowing down to levels that you would think based on the uncertainty of the election year. So M&A activity remains healthy. The next slide here, what we're showing is total M&A transactions from a deal count perspective, but also median deal size. And a couple interesting things to note here, in 2005, 6, and 7, you didn't have a whole lot in the way of activity or number of deals, but the average deal size was considerably higher, up in the 50, 49, 47 million range. Since 2009, we've seen an increase in the number of deals, but for the most part, the deal size has remained relatively consistent. You had a jump up in 2014 and 15, and more interestingly enough, in 2016, while the volume to date, 6,800, which remains healthy, the deal size has increased. Now we're going to look at some of the sectors that Ken Yeager and Chuck Seeley talked about. Specifically, this is the energy sector, oil and gas. What we can see here, starting in 2009, is an increase in activity in the number of deals, but as you can see down below, the median deal size has remained relatively small, comparable to 2005, 6, and 7. We see a peak in 2014 at 924 transactions. In 2015, that number came down to 871. And through the first three months, we're down to 236, but notice that the average deal size has dropped considerably, now down to under, I think it's under 32 million. So this sector will continue to see a decline in activity and a decline in the value of the deal. In the agricultural sector, again, this was another sector that was identified as being in distress. We saw the number of deals climb from 2009 to 2011, Then we saw a flattening out from 11 to 13. That's when we had commodity prices jumping through the roof. Once those commodity prices stabilized, you saw M&A activity jump back up in 2014 and 15. In 2016, most recently, you see commodity prices spiking once again. The deal volume is going to fall off. Although the deal size has remained relatively large at 12 million, I think we're going to see a considerable decrease in the number of transactions in this sector until commodity prices stabilize. In manufacturing, the number of deals since 2009 has also been on the climb. As we saw, it peaked at 3,389 deals in 2015. And into 2016, through the first 3 months, we're still seeing a relatively healthy number of deals. And the median deal size, while it's decreased from the peak in 2015, it's still around 2014 levels. So manufacturing, again, in the context of an election, I think we're going to continue to see a lot of activity in this area. In the healthcare space, this is one of those industries where we talked about a lot of activity primarily driven by consolidation. I think we're going to continue to see this. Again, activity starting in 2009 jumped up the deals. Into 2015, we had just over 2,000 deals. The deal size increased in 2016 year to date, and the transaction volume at 657 for the first 3 months remains healthy and should outperform last year. And lastly, we have brick and mortar retail. Again, this is a sector that was had been discussed in terms of, and the poll, all the attendees certainly indicate that the distress will continue in this area. Well, this is obviously evident if we look at the transaction volume from 2009 on. We reached 283 deals in 2011. It retracted a bit to 2013, then it spiked back up to 2015, where we saw 409 deals. And through the first 3 months this year, we have 162 deals. Again, this is going to be primarily driven by consolidation and competition driven by B2C and B2B e-commerce. So again, I think this is going to be an industry that with transaction volume is going to be high, but deal size is going to continue to drop. And lastly, and this goes back to Ken Mann's earlier point and slide, in the M&A world, we saw a peak in 2008 in terms of total capital invested. And in terms of deal count, we saw almost 2,400 deals in 2014, but you can see a precipitous drop since then in 2015 and into 2016 as the number of deals has dropped and the total capital invested is virtually non-existent.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. That last chart's a little alarming for an M&A guy in the distress space. That 159 transactions. Is that first quarter or through end of April?
Now that's first quarter. That's January through March. But more importantly, Ken, notice that the deal size, the total capital invested, barely registers on the chart.
Yeah. So you're talking about, annualizing at that trend, roughly 600 deals versus 2014, which was 2,400 deals. It's minuscule, and
right.
It's even way off of last year. And that would kind of hold true with what we saw at Heritage Equity Partners. 2014 was the busiest year in the history of the company, and 2015 was a close second, but it has slowed a bit since then. The only other thing I would note on some of the transactions where big multiples were seen in our experience was in the food and beverage space over the last few years. There were very high prices paid, and maybe over the last, I'd say, 12 months, we found a lot of buyers out there for troubled machine shops that were servicing either the military space or medical related space, and people were willing to pay up there. Before we get to Q&A, and then everybody, if you have any questions, please go ahead and log them into the question section. We'll try to read at least 2 or 3 of those before we wrap up. But Jerry, I'm curious your thoughts on, you touched a little bit about the demographics and the aging of the population. I also would say it's obvious that interest rates can't go any lower. Can you take a minute or two to talk about the interplay of interest rates, aging population, and what that is likely to mean to valuation multiples going forward?
Sure. When you look at the demographic-driven M&A activity, specifically in the what I call the SMB marketplace, we've been reading for the last 5 to 7 years now about this tsunami of transactions that's likely to happen as a result of the baby boomers selling their businesses. What we end up seeing is a combination of two things. One, after 2009, more and more business owners were reluctant to sell their business because they felt like their values weren't where they were prior to that, so they were willing to hold on and wait. Second thing is, you know, they're finding that they're not quite ready, because if they sell their business, the money that they're going to receive from the sale of their business, they have very few opportunities to invest this money with a certain amount of, or with a relative amount of certainty wherein they can continue living that lifestyle. So combination of that is what's happened is more and more people are holding on to their businesses, and as a result, that tsunami that they've been talking about has been pushed out. Now, what's ultimately going to happen is you're going to have these business owners ready to sell. They're going to get to the point where they no longer want to run it, and they're going to want to sell, and you're going to have more sellers than you will have buyers. So I think the economics of that are going to drive multiples down, and that with a combination of rising interest rates, because most transactions in this space are financed with bank debt or debt that has a coupon associated with it, that's going to have a tendency to squeeze multiples.
Okay.
Downward.
Thanks. Okay, so we have some questions online that answers have already been typed in for, and some that have not. So let me try to jump around and get to a couple of these questions. For Ken Yeager, how do tuition subsidies address the issue of college being overpriced? Isn't that just shifting the cost from a student to the taxpayer?
Ken, the question is absolutely right. There is a shift from student to taxpayer. However, in typical government fashion, and the best example of this was with the CMS and the healthcare space, is that they also started to mandate caps on revenue and driving the, and so you can imagine for some of your smaller community colleges that would be forced into caps on these tuitions, this would be a bit of a problem for them. Force them to sell or go out of business rather than raising tuitions, because they would be forced not to be able to do so. So there.
Okay. This one's also for you, Ken. When it comes to the energy markets, does U.S. government policy really matter that much, or is it really driven by OPEC and supply and demand?
In the short term, it's all about supply and demand. There's very little from a policy or a policy change that can drive that. Long term, such as drilling rights and access ways and tax subsidies, you can affect the industry. But short term, there's little you're going to see from a political correction.
Okay. Here's someone in California. Our current experience in Southern California is that there are more buyers, whoops, sorry, the screen moved, more buyers than sellers for small businesses. What is going to cause the shift that was just discussed, where there are more buyers than sellers?
Yeah, this is Jerry Wilcox, and I'll attempt to answer that question. I think what I had indicated is what's going to happen is as the baby boom generation holds on to their business longer, and they're going to get to a point where they're going to be forced to sell their business, or sell not necessarily on their own time frame. Therein, I think you're going to create a situation where you have more sellers than buyers, as opposed to what you're experiencing out there in Southern California. And obviously, the other thing, so if you have more sellers, more people looking to unload their business, that's going to drive the values. That's going to drive the values that they're going to get. It's going to drive them down. And what I was trying to illustrate before is if we find ourselves in a rate where interest rates go up, that's going to put a squeeze on valuation, and that's not going to bode well for the sellers.
Yeah. Question from Steve in Mississippi. Is there an active private equity interest as buyers for middle market and lower market businesses in the distressed arena? I'll take that one. This is Ken Mann. The answer to that is yes, there definitely has been. As multiples got so high in the market at large in 2014, private equity began to focus more and more attention in the distress space where they thought they could find reasonable pricing. This is largely driven by two things, though. Size. You know, if you have $1 billion to invest, you really don't want to do it $1 million at a time. There's just too much work involved per transaction. So they tend to look for bigger transactions, at least $5 million of capital being invested. And of course, this varies by fund. We do know a fair amount of small family offices and private equity that will look at smaller deals, but most are looking for at least investments of $5 million, many looking for investments much larger than that. The other thing that seems to be common is if you're just a job shop type business, you're just a commodity producer, you don't have anything proprietary, private equity is probably not going to be interested unless they already have a platform company in that space, and there's there's some economies of scale or some cost savings that they think they can quickly realize. But for sure, there is private equity interest. I believe that interest will wane as the baby boomers retire and there are more and more healthy deals on the market. If they're priced reasonably, then people may shy away from looking at the distressed deals unless that happens to be their area of expertise. Let's see. Bear with me one second. Let me find another question that hasn't been answered. Sorry, I'm having a hard time scrolling down. Okay. Somebody asked, and we answered this a little bit in writing, but in summary, is business in better shape in the future with the Democrats or the Republicans? And I think the answer to that, I'll let anybody else jump in after me, is that we don't believe that who's president really has an impact on the economy at large. That's what studies show. They would show you that historically the economies have done better with Democrats in the presidential office. However, that hasn't held true in other countries around the world. But we do believe, and what Ken Yeager pointed out in his portion, is that presidential policies do impact specific industries for sure, and we tried to highlight which industries we thought could be impacted. Anybody else want to add to that?
The only thing that I would add, and this is Jerry Wilcox, and one of the things we haven't talked about is in the context of this conversation today is the deficit, the rising federal deficit, and what either of the two groups, the Democrats or the Republicans, their platforms on how to address that. Clearly, what we've heard, what we've read so far, which subject to change, it seems, on a daily basis. On Trump's side, he wants to obviously cut spending on certain areas. He wants to rev up spending and defense spending. But I think overall, with the Republicans in charge of the Congress, deficit reduction has been part of their platform, and that would serve to certainly help out, putting the country back in a better place, and also would also, again, talking about uncertainty in M&A world, that would also reduce some of the uncertainty and the fear. Whereas if you look at platforms like Hillary Clinton's or Bernie Sanders, for that matter, where they want to turbocharge spending and the deficit doesn't seem to be as big of a concern, I think that's going to drive a considerable amount of uncertainty in the markets, which is not going to bode well for M&A activity.
All right, thanks. We're going to answer two more questions and then wrap up. The million-dollar question is there any forecast on when the distressed market will come back? Like a lot of you, I've been attending conferences, ABI, TMA conferences for years, where people predict the coming tsunami of distressed deals and how it's going to turn around. And I guess we've been wrong for a long time, but eventually we will be right. And hopefully on the screen right now you're looking at the slide that shows an uptick in delinquencies and charge-offs. Obviously economies are cyclical. When credit's easy and they lend a lot of money, the distress market isn't really there because it's just so easy to hide sins and keep borrowing money. But when credit tightens, then things change. You know, it's when the tide goes out, you can see who doesn't have swim trunks on. And if you look at this graph, I mean, delinquencies can't be any lower, and there is a little bit of an uptick. I hate to say that the tsunami is coming, but if interest rates go up, there has to be an increase in the distress market. I don't think it'll be a huge increase in bankruptcy filings, though. I think you'll see people use receiverships and assignments for the benefit of creditors more and more frequently than bankruptcy because it's prohibitively expensive for small companies. The last question I'll answer is, I'll give a quick answer and then maybe turn it over to Jerry. And the question is, lots of deals that we're working on don't have any EBITDA. What's the approach to valuing those businesses? And since I particularly sell companies that are in that position, I'll try to answer that question first. And that is, you usually have to build up kind of from the asset base. You know, what could you liquidate the equipment for? What could you liquidate the asset, or I'm sorry, the inventory for? What do you have in collectible receivables? Evaluate the intellectual property as best you can, and that gives you a rough sense of a starting point. But really, the only way you get the answer is to subject it to a competitive process and see what the market is willing to pay. But you can't really use multiples of EBITDA because any multiple times zero is zero. Jerry, if you want to try to add to that, I'm going to see if anybody has their hand raised.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, you know, working with some distressed transactions myself, you know, when you're talking about a buyer, you have to look at the profile of the buyer. If the buyer is a financial buyer, obviously buying a distressed company is not necessarily, you know, you're not going to be based on EBITDA. As you pointed out, there can be some asset value, some net asset value that's of interest to a financial buyer. But, you know, traditionally, you know, the only time you're going to see, you know, a strategic buyer, if they come into a distressed situation, what they're going to look at is primarily the revenue history and the possibility of a return to revenue based on some of the synergies that they can bring to the table. So, absent of strategic, I would say that's, you know, it's net asset value as you've illustrated.
Okay. Apologies to Michael Viscount, who has had his hand up for 24 minutes. I'm going to unmute you, Michael. Feel free to ask away.
You know what? Actually, I have not had my hand up.
Okay.
I'm just sitting here listening intently and gaining all the knowledge you guys are throwing out at us.
Thanks. Well, I'm glad that I mistakenly thought that your hand was raised so I could get one compliment in. I appreciate it.
You got it.
All right, everybody. Well, again, we really appreciate you taking the time. We want to be respectful of your time and wrap up here. I'd like to thank the guest panelists, Jerry Wilcoxon, Ken Yeager, and Chuck Seeley for sharing their expertise, but really particularly the audience for joining us today. We hope you found the webinar interesting and informative. In the coming days, you'll see a link to a very brief survey. We welcome your participation. We encourage your honest feedback so that we can make future webinars better. We're learned that we shouldn't do these because they're not of value, so be honest to us with us and your feedback. You'll also be able to download a PDF of our slide deck, and we'll provide a link if you would like a recording of this presentation, which would include the audio and video. All four of us welcome an email or a call from any of you to discuss this webinar or any of our respective firms' services. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.